So tonight's a very special show, and I'm really glad you guys are here for it. It's called Flying University, and we started this just 3 months ago with the goal of telling some stories on this stage of forgotten histories or neglected narratives, things that you aren't going to hear in university, things that you aren't going to hear talked about kind of in the mainstream science. And so tonight we're really excited to be partnering with the autism news magazine Spectrum, to who they have organized our speakers tonight. So our speakers tonight, and this is the order they'll be going in: Lindsay Nebaker, Sarah Luderman, and Morenike Giwa Onaiwu. It is my great pleasure to welcome to the stage your first speaker, Lindsay Nebaker.
Love is a very abstract concept that many people with autism have a hard time grasping. And it's one of those things that's not concrete. As a scientist, I wish I could put it into perspective as a type of subatomic particle, but it's not. Love is basically more like a force. Like in physics, you have forces and forces of attraction. And I have a feeling that love is the best way to describe that is a force of attraction between two people that is neither visible, measurable, or heard. There's no way to quantify it.
My name is Lindsay, musician, photographer, activist, and one of the featured subjects in the Emmy-nominated documentary Autism in Love. Jalal-ud-Din Rumi, a well-known Persian Sunni Muslim poet who lived during the 13th century, once stated, "Your task is not to seek for love, but merely to seek and find all the barriers within yourself that you have built against it." My story with Dave began a little over 12 years ago at a national autism conference in Nashville, Tennessee. Dave, who was completing his master's in meteorology, had traveled from Virginia to give his presentation, and I had recently moved from Nashville, fresh out of college, to try and break into the music industry. We struck a conversation, hung out a few times, and at the end of the conference, I offered him a ride to the airport. We kept in touch, long distance, for a few months before we met again in Roanoke, Virginia, to present at another conference. And at the end of that visit, inside a bookstore cafe, Dave placed his hands on top of mine and asked me to be his girlfriend. And I accepted. My decision to date him had very little to do with the coincidence that we both shared an autism diagnosis and similar journeys with early intervention. His intelligence, honesty, and passionate interest in the weather were really what drew my curiosity towards him. We dated long distance for the first 2 years. And then we spent the next 2 years living together in Mississippi. And then in 2009, we moved to the Washington, D.C. area, where we remain today. Prior to moving to D.C. and being involved in the documentary Autism in Love, Dave and I had already established some familiarity with national media exposure. And we also were active presenters in the disability community. It is known that romantic relationships in autism often face the challenges of communication and social interaction. But the strategies Dave and I managed to develop had been working well for us. Although there were aspects that catered uniquely to needs related to autism, other principles were universal across relationships in general. We both understand the language of love, but we happen to interpret it differently. As a classically trained pianist, I have an artistic approach. To me, our love is like a contemporary symphony full of off-key chords and uneven beats. But when one makes the effort to listen to it intently, the listener learns to appreciate it. Dave has developed a more scientific approach. Slide credits, Dave. Taking an adaptation of the electromagnetic spectrum, that's a tongue twister. Taking an adaptation of that spectrum, he formulated love as a romantic feeling spectrum. The alpha waves to the left, representing the physical attraction and general interest, rolling into the beta and the gamma, resembling a visibly intense crush. But as love evolves and matures, it exits the visible realm into the delta waves, the blue on the right. Not visible and not as intense, but a stronger, more sustained true love. What we do both agree on is love is not tangible. And when concepts are not tangible, many of us who are autistic tend to gravitate towards thinking of concepts into tangible ways to help us understand them better. By the time the filming of Autism and Love started, Dave and I had already been dating for 8 years. We owned a house, practically lived like we were married, but we had not yet seriously discussed making that legal commitment. A lot of things can happen while you're participating as a subject in a documentary, growth being one of them. And it was no doubt that our relationship did take shape to the extent where, during the film crew's final visit to the East Coast, Dave proposed to me on camera. 18 months later, the documentary premiered at the Tribeca Film Festival in New York. And later on that year, Dave and I married in Washington, D.C., surrounded by a presence of 30 guests. Engagement and marriage are events that are meant to seal a stronger foundation, to make a loving connection feel more permanent. But I didn't feel that way. A few days into our honeymoon, I fell into a deep depression, and it stayed there. 5 weeks, 10 weeks, 15 weeks. I isolated myself, and I questioned myself if our relationship was real. I will never forget the night when Dave said, "Lindsay, have you noticed that it's me that has always been the first one to say, 'I love you'?" There was no particular reason or red flags that indicated any potential danger. Dave had always been a gentle and respectful human, and we had experienced a lot together in our long adventure. But I dared to ask myself, why were we still together? Were we surrounded by social coercion, or had we grown too comfortable in our routines to deviate from it? I needed more time to think about all this. But the pressure to do what the filmmakers asked in order to make the final cut and the distraction of public exposure clouded my space to reflect what was happening. Authenticity is the shield that protects you from drowning in a sea of criticism, infighting, and verbal shaming. But when you are not certain about your own authenticity, you can easily be pulled into a void of self-hatred and worthlessness, especially when it comes from the people who you thought you could trust the most to protect you. It feels like a metaphorical stab in the heart. I was exhausted, spent of my energy. I felt everything and yet felt nothing. And a little over 3 months after our wedding day, in a public bathroom stall near a hotel lobby, I nearly ended our story. But before we continue, let's investigate further into this complexity called love. Because the truth was, there's more to the reason why I nearly ended our story. When you are a human living with a disability, you are probably aware of the types of barriers that are enforced by society, influenced by ignorance, as their attempt to protect you. Barriers that can ultimately prevent you from living a life that you truly want. But what if you personally did not grow up facing societal barriers? What if your caregivers gave you the freedom to pursue the dreams in your life, including love, romance, and marriage? Well, you see, there are the barriers that other people build against you. But there is a barrier that often stands, unspoken, and yet can be the most destructive of all. The barrier that you build against your own self. In a world where you are labeled as different and disabled, it's so easy to abandon yourself because you convince yourself you do not need joy and compassion. When you experience or witness any of the things being different can be exposed to, bullying, domestic violence, sexual abuse, stigma, discrimination, it is so easy to tell yourself you will never trust in anyone again. When you live in a world where it is encouraged to be perfect, it is so easy to convince yourself you are not enough. This was the only life that I knew, and I did not believe I was worthy of being loved. It's why I struggled to ingest the support that was provided to me. I thought I would welcome it, but instead, I was pushing it away. I wish that I had listened to the people who told me that I was enough, just the way that I was. I always knew Dave loved me. But it wasn't until I nearly ended my story 2 years ago in a public bathroom stall near a hotel lobby with 3 full bottles of prescription pills and several shots of alcohol. How genuine and raw Dave's love truly was for me. I was found by a security guard, blacked out, unresponsive, and lost 22 hours of my memory. It amazed me how I even survived that night. But even more so, it amazed me to witness the courage and selflessness Dave had demonstrated. He remained in my hospital room all throughout the night. He was there after I was discharged. He bathed me and clothed me. He tidied my room, turned on the heating blanket each night before I crawled into bed, made sure I was nourished, and allowed me to hold him when I needed to be held. My heart burst with gratitude to a degree I had never experienced before. For the first time, I realized how profoundly lucky I was to have Dave in my life. In the weeks and months that followed, Dave and I would continue to face challenges in repairing our life together. Nurturing was no longer a luxury. It became an essential exchange. It opened my eyes to how truly profound Dave's love is for me, and it opened Dave's eyes to realizing how he should never again take for granted the moments we have together. Dave could have distanced himself out of fear, but he was there. and he gave me the one thing that I needed to help survive: love, the essential non-physical ingredient to human survival. Love, the ultimate conqueror of adversity. Dave spoke softly as he cradled me in his arms. I am so glad that I get to hold you again for at least one more day. When your heart is stuck in that place, how do you begin to open the doors to let the love into you? When we strip down our layers and are given labels, the one thing that connects you and me is that we are human. We are born with desires, fears, and needs. We are hardwired for connection and validation. A human, every human, needs to feel love and be loved to survive. So while in autism, we often face the challenges of communication and social interaction, what ultimately ends up being the greatest challenge is believing we deserve the opportunity to experience love with validation, an opportunity that every one of us should have. It is okay to want to love and to feel the ecstasy and grieving that comes with it. It is okay to seek love and to risk the vulnerability that comes with it. Once you can convince yourself you believe in your own worth, you will be able to see the hands of love that are already being offered to you. When I reflect back on our journey, rather than obsess on fears and uncertainty, I try to focus on the memory of our beginning and why we chose to continue our story, and why I am willing to take the risk of opening my heart to believe. Yes, our story is real, very real. In closing, I want to leave you with this. You are worthy of love. Give yourself permission to open your heart to the world. Allow others who have offered to support to hold the space for you. And if at any time you find yourself where no one else is reaching out to you, just whisper to yourself, you hold more courage than you know. Yes, it's frightening to be emotionally vulnerable. But if you are able to look inside what has been given to you, you will have released yourself from the most destructive barrier of all. And after that, you are well on your way to living an empowered and purposeful journey. Are you ready to believe that you are worthy of being loved? Thank you.
What a beautiful story. We're very excited to welcome to the stage your second speaker for the evening, Sarah Luderman.
Hi, everyone. I just wanted to let you know that I'm going to be citing a bunch of really boring research during this talk. If you are interested in a list of studies that I cited during the next 15 minutes, please let me know during intermission or after the show. I'm happy to share. I also want to give a quick warning. I will be touching on suicide as a subject. If you need to leave, I won't be offended. Taking care of yourself is the most important thing. So for the past few decades, autism research has focused very heavily on biomedical questions. What causes autism? Is there a cure? Millions and millions of dollars every year are spent to discover whether Tylenol, whether your grandmother smoked, canned soup cause autism. In contrast, the US government only spends 1% of autism research funding on lifespan issues. Lifespan issues is a term that's supposed to encompass every issue affecting autistic people's lives after childhood. And I mean everything. Questions like where we'll live, what we'll do all day for the rest of our lives, and who will help us when our parents are gone for the 60-odd years after we turn 18, are all crammed into that 1% of funding. A lot of significant studies about autism and employment have been published in the past few years, which is heartening. There's still a lot we don't know, but here are some vast facts. Unemployment is high in the autistic community. By some estimates, 85% of autistic adults with college degrees are unemployed. In comparison, for the general population, a little less than 2.5% of college grads are unemployed. It's difficult to find information about autism employment specific to women. For example, one major study tracked 169 adults over the course of 10 years, which is really important research. Unfortunately, only 9 women completed the study, and of those women, none managed to maintain employment with any consistency, if they had any at all. In comparison, about half of autistic men in the study had kept their jobs during that time period, but it's hard to draw any kind of real conclusion from just 9 women. Other studies, unfortunately, also seem to indicate that autistic women have a higher unemployment rate than autistic men. So at minimum, it doesn't look good for people like us. There are a few different hypotheses as to why autistic women seem to struggle so much more than autistic men when it comes to employment. One suggestion is that autistic women have a higher rate of mental illness than autistic men. I'm a little bit skeptical. There isn't very much research to suggest that this is the case. I think that the higher rates of unemployment autistic women face have a different cause, though. Like all women, we are simply given fewer chances and looked upon more unfavorably by employers. Many of us struggle with the complex rules of appropriate womanhood. For example, I once wore a cocktail party dress to a job interview. I thought I was supposed to dress nice. I didn't realize there was a substantive difference between that and a suit. And don't even get me started about the minefield that is business casual. Many autistic women struggle with performing femininity in inappropriate and acceptable ways. And in our society, women who don't fit a specific mold face social rejection. And this is especially true in the workplace. One of the reasons there's so little research about autistic women in unemployment beyond the limited funding is that boys are much more likely to receive autism diagnoses at all. As a result, boys are overrepresented in basically all autism studies. Some people believe that this is the result of a female protective factor, some part of our genetic makeup that insulates us from loving trains too much. Personally, I think that the truth is that many autistic women without intellectual disability simply aren't identified. It isn't just that our autism looks different. It isn't just that some of us are better at aping social graces. It's that we're not seen. There's a sort of lost generation of women in our 20s and 30s that I'm a part of. Most of us aren't diagnosed until years after our male peers still, if we are diagnosed at all. After all, in the 1990s, common opinion was that autism was vanishingly rare in girls. We spent our lives believing that we are strange, singular monsters hatched alone in the dark, or at least that was my experience. My autism diagnosis was actually largely the result of my inability to get and keep a job. I reached a point in my life where the demands of adulthood outpaced my ability to cope, so my parents took me to a psychiatrist. I can only describe my transition to adulthood as a spectacular belly flop. I'd always done well academically. I'd gone to one of the best colleges in the country. I went on to do a graduate degree at a solid state school. Then I started sending out job applications. I often made it past the first round. I can write a decent cover letter, but interview after interview after interview and meeting face to face, I never got the job. And after a brief, disastrous stint moving back home with my parents, who were not pleased, I spent months couch surfing in New York and DC, hoping to catch my break. Finally, I landed an entry-level editorial assistant job at a medical journal in DC. My parents were elated. I was relieved. I could do it. I moved into a house with some other young professionals and a couple of cats. I was finally normal. I got fired after 2 weeks for being a bad cultural fit. To this day, I have no idea what that means. I probably said or did something socially inappropriate without realizing it, but I'll never know for sure. I thought my life was over. I tried to kill myself. Obviously, that didn't work. But many autistic people aren't so lucky. Suicide is actually the biggest killer of autistic adults without intellectual disability after heart disease. So since then, I've had a number of jobs with mixed results. The most important thing I've needed to do a good job are the ability to telecommute and a patient supervisor who's not afraid to experiment. Now I'm trying to work for myself, and if I fail, that's okay. I'll be okay. I've failed before. And I think that's really the most important thing that I learned from all of this, and that I really hope that other people learn, is that even if the deck's stacked against you, and even if everything looks like it's over, you can get up and try again. And it's true that some people have an easier time of doing that because they're not disabled or because they don't deal with those particular issues, but it's never actually over. So, thank you.
Well, our next speaker, we're very excited to have her. We've been setting up her slides. Please welcome to the stage, Morenike Giwa Onaiwu.
Well, the great thing about having all these bright lights is I don't have to make eye contact with any of you. But I'm going to get started. My presentation is longer than the other two that you had, so I do apologize for that, but hopefully it will be worth your while. There is plenty of wine over there, so you'll be all right. But another thing I want to say before we play a quick video, I want to say a couple of things, is that I like scripting. I always have since I was a child. My children say that there's not a situation that I don't have a song lyric for. And so when I saw this space, I walked in and I was like, wow, this place is just, it's cool, it's beautiful. It feels like I'm, in a spoken word or a comedy, club or something like that. And so there was a part of me that just was so much wanted to just kind of do that scene from 8 Mile. Hey, everybody from the 313, throw your effing hands up and follow me. So I just had to get that out, or I won't be able to proceed. All right, so now that that's done, I can be a little more professional. So, I am Morenike Giwa Onaiwu, and I am an autistic woman. I'm obviously Black, not just super tan. And when I was trying to think of kind of an icebreaker, an example that I would give before my actual presentation itself, I thought of something that was so absolutely ridiculous that I have to share it with you. Because I was trying to think, okay, being Black, being autistic, there's so much to unpack, and you'll see, and that's why I'm going to talk for 40 minutes. But the first thing that came to my mind wasn't the best thing, but it was a truthful thought. I thought back to when I was a little girl. And when I was a little girl, I had natural hair, and all of the little girls started getting, their hair when you get older in the Black community. Hopefully it's changing, at least with my daughters. But there's like a rites of passage. When you get to a certain age, you chemically process your hair, either with a relaxer to straighten it, or when I was younger, a curl, a jerry curl is what they called it. And so you guys are on the East Coast, but if you were on the West Coast, that was the thing to do, the jerry curl, you know. And I got one, and I absolutely hated it because it was a sensory nightmare. The smell, the feeling of the stuff, it grossed me out to the point where I literally never put the product that you're supposed to put to keep it all curly and glossy on, and it dried out and basically fell out and had to start all over, and I was glad. I was so glad because it was disgusting to me. And it was interesting because when I think about it, I was like, okay, well, you know, why is it that so many people were able to, you know, wear that hairstyle for years and years? I mean, that's how Michael Jackson's hair caught on fire. You know, he had one of those. You know what I mean? Why were people able to wear it? And they could dance and be everywhere and just so excited and happy, and I couldn't even stand it for a day. And I realized that those were some of the many hidden cues about my sensory differences that I didn't know about until, you know, nearly 3 decades later. So for a little comic relief before the actual presentation starts, I'm going to show you a quick video from the movie Coming to America. It's a commercial called Soul Glow.
You know, you can be all the things you've always wanted to be. Beautiful, sexy, easy as 1, 2, 3.
Just let your soul glow. Just let it shine through. Just let your soul glow, baby. Feeling oh so silky smooth. Just let it shine through. Just let your soul glow.
Soul glow.
Perhaps I should cut off my prince's luck.
No.
Yes.
You must be out of your goddamn mind. Joe Lewis.
Sorry, I can't watch that without laughing, but. Okay, so I'm going to get into the actual presentation itself. Thank you for bearing with me about that. And so my presentation is entitled The Intersection Between Race and Autism. And I put and gender because this is a flying university about women on the spectrum. I am a woman on the spectrum. And so this is me. I'm Marenike Giwa Onaiwu. If you're using social media, then I'm at Save Ryan White D on Twitter. That's the Twitter handle I use for the Ryan White Part D advocacy, which is a program for HIV-affected families from birth to adulthood. And so you're welcome to follow along if you need. So I'm not really a stuffy presenter. So if you need to move around, if you're tired of sitting because you've been sitting for a while, if you need to move around, move around. Please don't, bother people or anything when you're moving, but feel free to use technology. So if you want to, I don't even know if you have reception because we're kind of, on a lower floor, but if you want to tweet things out on social media or whatever, take pictures and consider flapping. I'm kind of partially a sensory seeker and partially an avoider, so clapping usually doesn't bother me. I mean, I expect clapping if you're in a venue like this, unless it's like all autistic people, then I don't. But just putting that, there's a couple of just housekeeping reminders for you all. You aren't going to just make me feel bad if you need to go to the restroom or you need to move around or whatever. It's cool. So. This is kind of the overarching theme or philosophy that I want to share that kind of undergirds my entire presentation. So I'm going to be talking about autism from the perspective of neurodiversity. And that's this was coined by Nick Walker, in terms of this definition. There's many definitions, but it's essentially that all of us, like you look around this room, it's very unique. I mean, New York is one of the most diverse places in the United States. You have people from all walks of life. We have people from all backgrounds, and we have probably just as much, if not as many more types of brains, all types of different ways to be. And all of this is just a variation of the human species, and there's nothing wrong with any of them, just like there's nothing wrong with any of your gender identities or your height or your race or what have you. So this is, just kind of keep this in mind. I am not, as an autistic woman, I am not talking about autism from a deficit perspective at all. I'm talking about it as a part of my identity just as much as my name or my ethnicity or my gender or what have you. So why should you care about any of this? I mean, some of you are autistic, some of you are not. But this is kind of basically just a slide to talk about. So women are misdiagnosed and underdiagnosed a lot. Within communities of color, which we'll talk about that more, it's even more. It happens even more so. And there are a lot, the reason why this is focusing on women on the spectrum is because women are kind of an afterthought. I mean, if you think about Light It Up Blue, Anyway, blue is perceived as a boy color. I'm not going to talk about the organization that does that yet, but but essentially they're not inclusive of autistic women and girls. And my definition of girls is an inclusive, women and girls is inclusive. So that's cisgender and transgender women. And then that's supposed to say considerable bias that exists as well. So this is why we need to talk about this. This is why this is an important topic. So the intersection of race and gender. So when things intersect, if you think about intersecting lines in math class when you're a kid, they're meeting, they're coming together. So I wanted to just take a moment to talk about what intersectionality is and what it ain't. Okay, so a lot of people talk about intersectionality, we hear it all the time. It has kind of morphed to have a new meaning in terms of all of us have different intersections or overlapping identities about who we are. So that is true. Someone could stand up here and they could be like, oh, they could be queer, they could be, Muslim, they could be, deaf, they could be whatever, liberal. They could have all these varying different identities that overlap. However, the initial definition of intersectionality, if you're not familiar, I just always like to give props to the people who founded things, was Dr. Kimberly Crenshaw. And so essentially, she was looking at the fact that people with marginalizations, multiple marginalizations, the intersection of the different things that make us different, make things more complex. So it's a lot, we all have different privileges and we all have marginalizations as well. And so it's different. It's not the case of, the intention of the term was initially supposed to be used for individuals with marginalization, so individuals of color, with disabilities, what have you. So now it's kind of become a catch-all word, and there's nothing wrong with it. But it's just important to understand the context from which the term even came. That's important to kind of look at. So intersectionality is more than just a term that you see all over social media. It's important. Audre Lorde, talks about how we don't live single-issue lives. A lot of us have lots of things that we're passionate about. I'm passionate about autism. I'm also passionate about HIV advocacy. I'm also passionate about racial justice, about adoption, about a lot of things. So when these two or more systems of oppression come together, essentially it's a lot different. I am an English speaker. And I am a speaking autistic. So that is something, I have a privilege that someone who is a non-speaking autistic doesn't have. But if that person is a white, cisgender Christian male, and I am a black, woman or what have you, then we've got some things that, these are two areas in which where I'm lacking privilege in those areas, even if I have privilege in another area. So, speaking of privilege, autism has a white privilege problem. It does. There are a lot of disparities in autism. And I know people are tired of hearing these terms, but it's just the truth. Because we all know that autism is no respecter of person. It can occur, and it does occur. It's, in anyone. It's a naturally occurring, condition that you can find in people of all walks of life. We know that, but that's not what we see when we look at data and statistics. We see a lot of disparities with regard to autism. I'm going to talk about some of them. So with regard to identification and referral, I'm going to give you some, so I know Sarah said she was going to give some boring stats. I liked her stats, personally. Mine might be boring, but they're interesting to me. Because when I talk, I am going to share some things from personal experience, but I like to back what I'm talking about with fact. Because I can give you anecdotal, and I think that there's an important place for that. But there's also an important place to see literally exactly what's happening, what's going on. So there are a number of research studies that I reviewed when putting this presentation together. And with regard to identification and referral, there are studies that have demonstrated that doctors are more likely not to use the gold standard in terms of screening and evaluation tools that are used for screening a child with a developmental delay and most likely and possibly an autism diagnosis. They're less likely to use those in children of color. They're also less likely to make a referral to a developmental specialist or what have you, even if the child is presenting with a delay. In some cases, there was as much as a 15.5-month delay. That's over a year. On the flip side, there's some data that African American parents may be less likely to perceive or report certain social communication difficulties as a concern. So you've got a parent maybe their child's not, likes to line things up like, my son still does. Or they flap their hands, or they're using a lot of repetitive language or what have you. And maybe that parent isn't worried because they're like, oh, that's just how JJ is, no worries. It's cool. He's well-behaved, he's, seems happy, he seems okay. That parent may not think that's a big deal. Oh, he'll grow out of it. If he's autistic, he's not going to grow out of it. But the point is, the parent is not really that worried about the thing. So they may not come to when they're asking you questions. We all know the way the medical system is these days. You're in that room, you're in and out pretty quickly. They're not spending an hour with you just at a pediatrician's appointment. And so if you don't share something of it, if you don't think it's a concern, then they're not looking for it. So the research has found that if there is a behavioral issue, the parent will mention the behavioral issue, but they're less likely to mention the little quirks. They don't really think it's a big deal that, he, talks all day long about, robots or whatever. It's cute, But if he's fighting or, self-injurious behaviors or what have you, then the parent may share it. So the statistics of parents of color and white parents sharing those concerns were the same, but in terms of children of color, they're more likely to be misdiagnosed as having some type of other psychiatric disability. And so in addition to that, with diagnosis, so there's just some staggering numbers I want to give to you. Depending on the studies you're looking at and the data from the CDC, white children are between 19 to 30% more likely to be diagnosed with autism than an African-American child. And they are between 50 and 65% more likely than a child that's Hispanic or Latin. Now, another statistic that's concerning is that Hispanic and Asian children are more likely to be diagnosed with both autism and an intellectual disability. So in the case of when they're not presenting with cognitive difficulties, they might fall through the radar. So this is a concern with diagnosis, a huge concern. Another diagnostic concern in terms of the white privilege problem with diagnosis is that African-American children are slated to be diagnosed between 1.5 to 2 years later than their white peers. And we're controlling for socioeconomic status, education, and all of these things, and symptomology with these terms. Another one is treatment and access. So when you are of a social economic status where you are struggling, there's often up to a 3-year time lag in between diagnosis and accessing treatment. With people of color, it's even higher. Also, white children on the spectrum are more likely two-thirds more likely than children of color to be receiving a variety of services. So a child of color, a Hispanic child, or a black child may only be getting services at their school district, or maybe only be getting services through a speech therapist, but it's more likely that a white child will be referred to a variety of services, speech therapy, occupational therapy, what have you, and to kind of complement and give them the resources that they need. And while I'm no fan of over-therapizing, I am a fan of meaningful supports, and if a person needs supports, we want them to be able to access them and assist you in building your strengths. In terms of perception as well, students with disabilities are 2 times more likely to be suspended than children without disabilities. When you add a child of color, the number increases even more. And then in terms of, so there was some data that was ran by the Department of Education about autistic students of color and white autistic students. White autistic students were more likely to be diagnosed as an AU, classification or category in their school district. But a lot of the autistic children who were of color, particularly African American, were labeled as specific learning disability or emotionally disturbed. There are certain services, resources, and protections that you do not get when you are misperceived that way, when you are when you're not labeled appropriately, and then that leads to disparities in outcomes. So children of color in general are more likely to be arrested at school, and when disabled children of color have a dropout risk that's almost double that of other children of color. So these are major concerns. These have impacts beyond when they're children. Children grow up and become adults. So beyond the white privilege problem, there's a male problem. a male privilege problem in autism as well. Sarah touched on it some. And so this is with regard to women and diagnosis, women and girls. And I'm going to go a little quick bit faster through these stats because I want to share some other things with you all. But there's a lot of information. Women and girls are not identified and referred as quickly because of the camouflaging skills that women tend to present with. They present differently, and people perceive autism as more of a male thing. Even in some of the biomedical research, you see that terminology. Boys are 4 times more likely to be diagnosed, and women are often diagnosed later in adolescence, in adulthood, after being early diagnosed with depression or OCD or anxiety or a variety of different labels that were not necessarily accurate. And we are perceived as not really autistic when people don't realize behind the scenes the many coping mechanisms that we're putting in place to just do what neurotypical people do without even thinking. We exhaust ourselves from pretending to be normal, or even if we're not pretending to be normal, even if we're comfortable in our own skin, just from functioning in a world that's not designed for us. So we're seen as not having a legitimate disability when society is not at all very inclusive or welcoming of autistic people, whether you're male or female. And so we use these coping mechanisms, our declarative memories, our social scripts, and we use guides. We'll have an extroverted friend or what have you to help us navigate things. Or we'll go do an event, and then we'll cocoon ourselves away for days to function. And this is not what's seen by others. So therefore, the disparities that we have in terms of, so we're perceived in this way, and there's a lot of disparities. I'm going to give some stats. These are for disabled women. These are not isolated for autistic women. I wish they were, but unfortunately, kind of like Sarah said, in a lot of these studies, there are so few women that are even included a lot of the time in studies of any substantial size that I can't give data that I could feel would be accurate to you. There is data, but it's not one that I feel comfortable sharing. And so disabled women in general, in comparison to their non-disabled peers, are 4 times more likely to be raped. They are 2.5 times more likely to be a victim of some other type of sexual violence. So maybe forced fellatio, maybe fondling, maybe what have you, maybe being sexually harassed in some way. We saw the Me Too movement, need I say more? 2 times more likely than a non-disabled woman to be a victim of not a victim, we're not victims, we're survivors, to experience physical violence. 3 times more likely to be stalked. 2 times more likely to experience psychological abuse. 2 times more likely than a non-disabled woman to have our reproductive rights, our own bodily autonomy denied, either not allowed to use birth control or forced to get an abortion or what have you, or forced to bear children when we're not ready. And in terms of leaving our abusers, a lot of the programs that are set up for intervention are not disability friendly, and they also don't take into account that if you're a person with a disability, you might be dependent financially, emotionally, and possibly even physically, because there's co-occurring, conditions you might have on this partner. So it's not as simple as just walk away from that toxic person and go to the shelter that's loud and doesn't allow you to, do things that you need to do to calm yourself or to cope. So there's a lot to be unpacked here in terms of these disparities aren't just, so they're missing some women, they're missing some Black and Hispanic people, Asian people, and it's not an and, it's a concern. Because we're right here, and we've always been right here, hiding in plain sight. I like the work of this artist. We are here. Autism can be found in any gender, race, age, class, cultural orientation. We are right here, but are you seeing us? I want to talk a little bit about worldview, and so in perception and worldview. So we know cognitively that this thing is not moving, but it certainly looks like it's spinning, because again, perception, worldview. So I'm going to talk a little bit about myself in terms of that. So as you can probably guess from the name Marenike, my family's not from America. So I was born to a family of West African immigrants. I was the only girl. I was sandwiched in between 2 boys. My parents were going to college here and various internships and what have you. They moved around various parts of the Midwest. We ended up settling in the South. And that's, I lived in the South, on the West Coast, a couple of different places. But that was, essentially home. That's where I live now. And I never fit in. And I never really knew why. And I always had different reasons. I was like, okay, maybe it's because I'm kind of tomboyish. I don't have sisters, I don't have brothers, so I like to run and fight and kick. But there were other girls who were tomboyish, so that wasn't it. I was like, okay, maybe it's because, not a lot of diversity in my school, a whole bunch of white faces, So like maybe it's just, when you're, like a little speck of brown in a sea of white, maybe you're just really different and people see you as different. But that wasn't always it either. And then I was like, okay, maybe it's because there's some social norms I don't get because I'm, first generation American. There's certain things that, people know that they do that are kind of part of their family culture or customs and that aren't part of mine. I was always trying to find a reason, like what was it? Because I was accepted at home, but in society, I was weird, I was different. I talked like a white girl, I didn't move right, I just wasn't like everybody else, and I wasn't really sure why. And I would do things like go in the mirror, and I did this faithfully for days. I would go in the mirror and I would practice how to speak. I would watch my classmates. There was a certain way they spoke. And I didn't really like how they spoke. I thought it sounded kind of weird. But I didn't like having attention called to me. I wanted to blend into the woodworks and just kind of not be, because when you blend in and you don't stand out, you're not a target. You don't get hurt, you don't get bullied, you just kind of do your thing. So I would practice speaking and saying certain things and certain expressions and certain movements so that I could, use them and sound natural. I came up with kind of little, mental flow charts in my head of situations. When this happens, you do this. When this happens, you say this, and so on and so on and so forth. And that's kind of how I lived a lot of my life. I have my brain is like an internal, like a digital file cabinet of all these different things, that I had to kind of develop and learn to focus, to cope. And in a way, it worked. In some ways it didn't, because in some ways it took away from who I really was. Like I have a lot of internal stimming that I do, and I'm able to do that because I learned how to stim without bothering other people's access needs in terms of noise or movement. But it's something that isn't visible. So it's important to me now as a person who identifies as a disabled woman to to be myself, and so it's important so these coping skills have sometimes make you look less visibly disabled, and it gives you passing privilege, but is it really a privilege, or is it a burden that you've taken upon yourself because you've lost something of your own authenticity? So I want to talk a little bit about some other things that are important to me in terms of, so I think about my perception growing up. Again, perception and worldview is key. There were certain aspects, traits, characteristics that I viewed. So there were certain characteristics or traits that I saw within, so I looked at myself. And so yes, I understand that I'm again, a child of immigrants, but I'm a black woman. And although again, the black community is diverse, it has, there's, people from all different areas. But in terms of being raised in America, there were certain qualities that I saw within that I perceived in the area where I lived that were qualities that were attributed to black women and, I guess, neurotypical, non-autistic black women. And these were some traits that I thought these were things that kind of defined, kind of like the epitome, like what you're, traits that you're supposed to strive to be like or to have. And some of these were difficult for me as an autistic child or an autistic, coming of age person. I'm gonna share a few of them. So one thing that I thought of was like, I viewed black women as somewhat like the pillar of the family, of the community, kind of like that rock, that keeps everything together. Like, kind of the go-to person who comes up with ideas and strategy. There's a strong matriarchal, tradition, at least in the South, among black women. Well, that didn't really seem to me. I didn't really have this kind of, come to me and I've got the answer type of thing. I could be really uncertain and kind of flip-flop, on thoughts and ideas. And having that type of responsibility worried me. Like, would I be able to be, the Mama Joe of soul food or whatever, these people that seem to kind of, withstand struggle and stand strong. And, I would see these women, I was like, wow, I would watch documentaries about the civil rights movement, and these women to me just seemed so fearless and so smart and so on top of things. And I was like, whoa. And I know that you all had a presentation for the Flying University about women in the Black Panther Party. These are capable women, and I just didn't see how this would be something I could be. Another thing was being assertive and outspoken. Now, I could be assertive and outspoken, definitely, but I could also be quiet and, kind of introverted, and so it was difficult for me in terms of Black women were seen as so real, so truthful, so bold, and I loved it. But I was like, I'm like a freaking failure as a Black woman. I just can't do that stuff. Then the creativity. So one only needs to go on Instagram and watch Kylie Jenner to see the next thing she's culturally appropriated from Black women. So if it's hair, music, fashion, phrases, Black women are creative. I mean, it's interesting if you think about things. I mean, that they, to put together, sometimes even with, depending on one's income level, with very little, sometimes very resourceful in terms of creating things, and not just even just hair, music, fashion, literature and art and music. There's a lot of luminaries, Black, female luminaries, so creative. And I'm just kind of boring, I like wear black, and I'm sameness. I like things that are, concrete and, ritualistic. And so I didn't have that creative flair. I liked it. I thought it was cool, but I don't have an artistic bone in my body. And certain phrases sound absolutely ridiculous coming out of my mouth, So the resilience, long suffering, that kind of goes to the pillar of the family, but just in general, holding it down for, yourself or your people, or whatever, your community. I run out of spoons easily, and sometimes I can't be the rock that folks need to lean on. And then the nurturing piece. That I thought I could do, sometimes. But sometimes I don't want to nurture. Like, I have 5 kids. I love them. But sometimes I'm like, Mommy needs some me time, So it's like, I need to recharge. I love you. And they get it. They're autistic, too. Sometimes they don't want to be touched, Sometimes I kiss them, and they wipe off the kiss, They love me, but, it's too much sometimes. So I get it. So these are some things that were difficult for me because of being different. And there's some other things in general about the Black community that I saw. There are things that I really admired. Like, for example, the family get-togethers or community get-togethers, like Sunday dinners or barbecues or family reunions. Well, the idea of something like that, throwing something like that, and the noise level, and the folks hugging and kissing and dancing, just the sensory, I'm like, they look so inviting and cool. I was like, this is awesome. This is a very important tradition that I don't think I'll be able to do. You know what I mean? Some of the meals, particularly in the South, there's certain meals that, because of texture issues, wouldn't be things that I'd be able to prepare or eat, or because of the way that they smell. There also is a thing so in terms of respect, home training, there were little jokes that we used to make when I was a kid. Like, we'd watch people in the store, right? So we'd be in the grocery store, and there's a kid, and I'm just gonna say it like the way I'd say it if y'all were a room full of Black people. So a white woman in the store with her little boy, right? Mommy, yes, Johnny, I want the cookie. No, Johnny, you've had too many sweets today. But Mommy, I want the cookie. No, honey, you can't have the cookie. I want the cookie, I want the cookie. Fine, take the cookie. Now, this was our perception of Black women in the same store, same situation. Mommy, I want the cookie. No, honey, you've had too many sweets. You can't have the cookie. Mommy, I want the cookie. No, honey, I can't. Mommy, I... Okay, maybe not a fist. Maybe like a shoe, I don't know. But, or maybe just that look. That side eye. You're going to get it when we get to the car. You better act right in this store. Home training. Respect authority. You can express yourself, but you also need to demonstrate some authority, some parental authority, and speak, adults, you should, yes, ma'am, no, ma'am, yes, sir, no, sir, those type of things. Well, that seemed so formal to me. I was like, it just seemed odd to me that my friends would be cursing up a storm and acting crazy. As soon as their mom walked in, they're like stiff as a bird. Yes, ma'am. I'm like, the heck? You're just cursing and doing God knows what, and your mom came in the room. But it was that authority. I didn't understand. To me, it seemed like having a double life. I mean, I was pretty much the way I was. I didn't curse, but I was pretty much the same way I was in front of my mom that I was with other people. I was just kind of real. Wash the dishes. I didn't even use any of them, but okay, I'll wash them. So in another Black home, it got me popped across the mouth. But an autistic mom, she understood. You know what I mean? Wash them anyway. You know what I mean? So another thing was AAVE, or African American Vernacular English, which is, again, a dialect, which is just like Spanglish or anything else that people use when they're comfortable with oneself in one's environment. And it was something that was challenging for me to use. It just didn't seem natural. Again, with scripting, I've developed it. And it's something I wanted to be able to do because it's something in terms of kind of a connection with others. And then there are other things, like certain styles of activism. I would watch things like, Martin Luther King and these other different great, individuals who had this emotive way of dealing with people and these kind of like these marches and these rallies. And those things are difficult if you're autistic. Like, I went to the March for Our Lives with our children. I went deliberately late, found a spot where I could leave and left. I love those things. They're important, but they're very draining. There's lots of different ways to have activism, but there's certain things that have become kind of attributed to the way, if it's the civil rights movement or if it's Black Lives Matter or Movement for Black Lives or what have you, certain things that people kind of expect out of a Black activist that aren't necessarily a natural fit for me. They're a great way to make change, but they're not just a universal way. So, and then parenting. There's some things with regard to parenting. So I don't like small talk and mommy and me groups and all that kind of stuff. Like, the moms are really boring. I'd rather have fun on the floor with my kid, playing. I mean, like, it's just better to me. And then there were other things that I did. Like, for example, in the Black community in the South, at least, they believed in, schedules, walking at a certain time, feeding your children at a certain time, toileting at a certain time. Me as an autistic parent with autistic children, they kind of had the developmental timetable that just kind of worked for them. We just kind of roll with the flow. You know what I mean? I co-sleep and, carried my babies and extended breastfeeding and all that kind of stuff. And that's kind of hippie-ish and hokey in the Black community. It's not for everyone, and certainly not on the West Coast, but in the South. So, but there's a few other things. So I'm sharing some things that are kind of like general with regard to socialization and peace, but there's a darker edge to this. So at work, Sarah talked about a couple of jobs that she's had. So I've had situations where I'm very, very limited at work. So I'm autistic. I don't like hair and drama. I'm very simple. So I used to wear my hair in locks. Now I wear them in braids. Well, there were certain times where, especially when I had my hair locked, I would be concerned, am I going to get a job? Does this look professional? There's lawsuits out right now about being able to discriminate against people for that hairstyle. And if I don't have a relaxed hair that mimics the way white people wear their hair, am I going to be hired? But I need hair that's comfortable for me as a woman, as an autistic woman. And plus, it's the hair that grows out of my hair and that texture. I'm a sensory seeker. I like loud music, but Black person rolling down the street, loud music, stereotype, right? You know what I mean? I want to play it loud, but you know what I mean? And then being outspoken, coming up with your ideas, getting excited, not being able to always regulate tone. Well, now you're the angry Black woman. You're sassy, you're loud. You know what I mean? Just all kinds of craziness. Different other communication differences, like being free with your body, like music. I love music, but if you're dancing a certain way, oh, she's trying to stick out her butt, she's twerking. Now you're this freak. You know what I mean? Like, you just can't be you because I got to watch how because again, some man might get turned on, because they don't have self-control, so whatever. So, it's just ridiculous, but so these are different things that you deal with, or being seen as not personable because maybe your tone is flat or what have you, or just so many things. But I want to give a particular story of something that just recently happened to me. So I was driving, and in the car, I had my daughter in the car with me, and I got stopped by the police. Because, Texas, that's how we make our revenue, tickets. And the guy stopped me. And again, there is lots of statistic about the disproportionate number of police stops if you're a person of color, particularly if you're Black. And so he stopped me. And so he asked me to, step out of the car. And I did. And so I had this stimming toy that I have right now. I love this. Sometimes it's around my wrist. I have this all the time. I'll be teaching at work and I'll have this on. So I brought this out. And so now, because he stopped me, I'm kind of freaking out. So I'm more like, instead of just kind of doing it like this, I'm kind of like, because I'm kind of freaking out, right? So he's like, whoa, what is that? And I'm like, oh, it's a stimming toy. What is it? What are you doing with it? I was like, oh, I'm just trying to calm down. And, he's like, well, put it down. So I put it down. Now I don't have anything to hold, so now I'm flapping because I'm freaked out. I don't know if you're going to give me a ticket. What you're going to do to me? You might kill me. I don't know. So, I really hope not. But, I'm just saying, anyone, traffic stops aren't fun, even if you just get a warning. You know what I mean? So this flapping that you all in this room just know is just me being an autistic, just doing my thing. When I don't have something in my hands need to move, loud hands. He could have perceived that as me trying to slap or hit or hurt him. People have thought of that before. And he could have gone, or he could have perceived this as a slingshot, or who knows, me just having this simple toy in my hand. And if I had a delay in auditory processing or answering, or if I engaged in echolalia like I do sometimes when I'm nervous, and if he had said, what is that? And if I had said, what is that? Like I sometimes do, then he could have thought I was mocking him. Anything could have happened. If I'm not making eye contact, you're being shifty. What do you have to hide? What have you? So it's like you can be in danger. This isn't just you're quirky, you're different, you're weird. This could put you in danger. there's research studies about where they've shown an African-American person shoving someone and a white person shoving someone and asking people, and it was perceived that the African-American person was shoving with violence while the other one was shoving playfully. These aren't just jokes. This is real life. Real life being Black and autistic means you have this talk with your child. For the talk in white communities is the birds and bees. The talk that I have with my sons and my older two sons are not autistic. They are neurodivergent. My youngest son is the one that's autistic, and my daughter. I had to have a talk with them about don't wear hoodies. I'm just serious. No joke. No hoodies. No hoodies. If you're going to the mall with your friends, who's going? Javier, Daquan, and John, no, y'all can't go. 4 Black people, 4 Black and Hispanic people going somewhere, or 3. No, you can't, that many of y'all can't go to the mall in a group. They'll think you're a gang. No. You get stopped by a cop, yes sir, no sir, you give them whatever they want. If they're rude, hopefully they'll be polite. There's a lot of great cops, you know what I mean? But hopefully they'll be polite. If they're not, you take it. They spit on you, they talk to you crazy, you take it. We'll deal with it later. We'll make a report, we'll hand it through the proper channels, but you don't take justice now, because there's not gonna be justice for you if you do. I had to have talks with them about don't run. When you go to the store, what you don't wear and how you don't behave, so that in hopes that this will keep you safe, and it still may not be enough. It still may not be enough, but this is real life. Being Black and autistic might mean that you really like the library, like Reginald Neeli Latson in the picture in the upper left. He was an autistic young man who loved going to the library. He was 17, so he was old enough to go on his own, if I'm remembering correctly. He was waiting for the library to open because he was too early there that day, and someone in the neighborhood saw him loitering, didn't realize he was a teenager. So there's a Black guy loitering, he has a weapon, he looks suspicious outside the library. The police came and asked him questions. He was nervous, he kind of fled away, didn't answer his, didn't give his name, and turned into a big situation where he was assaulted by the cop. He defended himself, ended up imprisoned, solitary confinement, just a lot of horrible, horrible human rights abuses for the simple crime of wanting to being autistic and Black and wanting to go read a freaking book. Or Caleb Moon Robinson, who I've had the pleasure of meeting, actually a great young man. He was an autistic young man who got mad at school. He kicked a trash can. He was at school, first day of 6th grade. He was in the line, first week of 6th grade. He was having some trouble with some transitions. So they made a special rule for him that he could not leave the classroom unless everybody else had left, which made him stand out and look weird and different with his peers, because everybody else, you're changing 6 or 7 periods a day, can walk to their class, and you have to be walked by like a baby with an aid. He got upset one day and kicked a trash can over. And he was charged with felony assault, and an officer, whoa, that was loud, sorry. An officer handcuffed him for hours, and he was put in jail. His parents weren't notified, and he was basically facing felony assault charges, for several months, until a lot of people advocated in the community to get this dropped. These other 2 individuals, Melissa and Antonio, were murdered because a variety of reasons, abused and murdered, and it appears that, sadly, in Melissa's case, there were people who knew something was wrong, but no one spoke up, no one did anything. I mean, if Black lives don't matter, Black disabled lives sure as F don't matter. The Judge Rodenberg Center, the only place where it's still legal to use electric shocks on disabled people to stop them, and including autistic people, and there's a lot of people of color. This place is still open, getting federal money. You wear a backpack on your back, and you are shocked if you do an infraction, if you aren't doing something right. That's your discipline. And this is what we call torture. Literally, this is torture, but it's allowed to happen to people of color, to disabled people of color. So I've talked about a lot of things. And there's, that are heavy. And so I've talked about problems, that we face. The intersection of being Black and autistic, there's some, there are various different qualities, and some of them are challenges. But how can you help? How can you be part of the solution and not part of the problem? Well, one thing you can do is support and include all autistic people. So you can be sure that you don't divide us. So whether it's a non-speaking person, whether it's a speaking person, whether it's a Black person, a Hispanic person, a queer person, a straight person, however they present, you can speak and refer to and treat them in a respectful manner. And you can make sure not to use ableist language, treat us with pity. not using gender-centric stuff like male traits and male, and lighted up blue, because, more boys than girls on the spectrum. You can make sure that it's not seen as a white thing, because it isn't. It's an autistic thing. So these are some of the things that you can do is just in general, if you are inclusive of all autistic people, then that will include the ones of color. You can also be respectful and inclusive of all forms of communication. Presume competence. So we all present differently on the spectrum. So I am a speaking person, but many are not. I am no better than anyone who speaks using Proloco or PECs or any kind of means. I just have a privilege that they don't have. So for you to make sure that when people are talking about autism, they're not talking about it in this dehumanizing way. Oh, those poor things, some of them can't even speak. Their moms are just angels for dealing with them. I mean, an angel from heaven, a warrior mom, screw that. I've waited all my life to hear my son say I love you. He says I love you every day when he looks at you, when he smiles, when he plays, when he doesn't have to say the words I love you. Behavior is communication. So, trying to help people understand and look at and kind of presume competence in autistic people. Acknowledging that autistic people are experts in our own lives. So, nothing about us without us. We definitely want allies. In any community, you're always going to have important, wonderful allies, friends, neighbors, relatives, partners, professionals. We should all work together, hand in hand. Think about any movement from, the abolitionist movement to feminism, what have you. We always need our allies. Allies are important, but allies are to support, not stand in front of, not speak for, but to signal boost and amplify the voice of people, not speak over them. So if you're in an event about autism, there should be someone autistic there representing. It shouldn't just be parents and professionals. There should be someone who is autistic. You wouldn't have a women's rights conference and have all men. Oh, I know a woman. I got a sister. You're not a woman. It's not enough. So that's important. Help us to dismantle ableism and racism. So things from respectful language and depictions. There is so much disability inspiration porn. If I see one more freaking Facebook page about my son doesn't have any friends, nobody came to his birthday party, he has autism, could you send him a card and tell him how much you love him? Can we we'll make them an honorary homecoming queen because nobody's gonna vote for her. What is that? No. Advocate for diversity and inclusion. Bring attention to things that you see greater societal problems impact the autistic community even more. So if you have multiple marginalizations, things that impact, so institutionalization or, different things that, exist, different forms of discrimination from misogyny to transphobia to, what have you, racism, if they're impacting the larger, overall greater, individuals in that community. And then if you dial it down, it's so macro and micro, it's hurting other people. Speak out against policies and practices, laws that are unfair, be it affecting the Americans with Disabilities Act or health care or things regarding education or mental health, in terms of stigmatizing mental health. Have solidarity with other communities and challenge ideas that harm us. So those are some of the things that you can do to help. Here's another thing you can do to help. And you do not have to do this. I'm not plugging my book. But I'm very proud. This is my baby. Myself, Lydia XZ Brown, and E. Ashkenazi, we have edited and put out, in collaboration with Autism Women's Network, the very first anthology for autistics of color. There is nothing else that exists like this. It has individuals we've got an elementary school person all the way up to senior citizens, people from different countries, from different backgrounds, from different walks of life, sharing our stories. The website is autismandrace.com. You can find it on Amazon. Again, we're trying to share the experiences, the lives, the hopes, the challenges, the dreams of those of us who are at the intersection of race and autism. And this could be a great way that you could learn more, that you could hear our voices, you could amplify our voices. I'm going to quickly just read this. This comes from the preface that I wrote, and it says here, what does autism have to do with race? It seems simple, but it is extremely complicated. I urge you to read this anthology and explore this in depth as you dive into the hearts of the authors. They are yellow, brown, red, black, and multi-hued. They are young and old. They share their purpose, their passion, and their pain. But before you embark upon this journey, I have a spoiler. On every page, in every account, from every contributor, you will find one profound, universal theme threaded silently and artfully throughout the entire anthology. Again and again, you will find that the answer to the aforementioned question, now unspoken, what does autism have to do with race, is a gentle but resounding everything. In closing, I am the Autism and Race Committee Chair for the Autism Women's Network. We are an all-volunteer nonprofit. Everyone on our board is autistic. All of our volunteers are disabled. We are a small grassroots organization that tries to provide a voice for gender minorities, so autistic women, non-binary people, et cetera. And it's just so important to be inclusive and to ensure that we, there's a, Chimamanda Adichie talks about the danger of a single story. So having a single story about autism as something that affects little white boys or teenage quirky programmers or people who like trains doesn't include me, doesn't include my daughter, doesn't include my son, doesn't include many people that you all know and love and that I know and love. So let's look at the full spectrum of autism with all of its colors and all of its difference and its diversity. Let's celebrate that, not hide from that, not mask that. Thank you.
Thank you all so much for sharing your stories and being with us here tonight. Thank you all for being here so much.